Hello and welcome to the Fiscal channel. My name is Angela, and in this video we're going to continue the government topic by topic video lesson. We are moving on to a new topic, the workings of government 2, where we're going to discuss the various structures of government. We're going to discuss the unitary, federal and confederal governments. And then we're going to move on to political systems at work, where we are going to discuss how various political systems are formed in different states of the world in order to respond to the political situation in a particular state. So please stay with us, don't go anywhere, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Fiscal channel. Like I said earlier, we're going to move on to a new topic, the workings of government 2. So let's take a look at the learning objectives. Alright, so for this particular video lesson, we're going to begin with the unitary, federal and confederal governments. So these are various structures that are adopted by various states in the world. And then we're going to move on to political systems at work. There we're going to see how different political systems are formed from the forms and systems of government that we've discussed in earlier video lessons. So we're going to see how they merge various forms and systems to form a political system that responds to the needs of each state of the world. So we're going to discuss presidential republics, semi-presidential republics, constitutional monarchies, parliamentary republics, absolute monarchies, military juntas, and one-party states. So let's dive right into it. Alright, so we're going to begin with unitary, federal, and confederal systems. Let's start with unitary governments. A unitary government is a system of political organization in which a single central government holds the authority over and makes the majority of governmental decisions for all the political subdivisions within the states. So there is a single central government within that state, and this central government makes all the decisions within the states. There are no subdivisions within that government. So now let's move on to the next slide. Alright, in a unitary state, all powers of governance are concentrated solely in the central government with no power sharing arrangements with other component units. There are no states or local governments in a unitary system. All the powers of government within the states are in the hands of the central government. Nonetheless, the central government has the authority to delegate powers to created component units which operate in accordance with its directives. So they can delegate power to various component units, but these component units answer to the central government. So they obey all the directives that the central government makes. So it is different from a federal or a confederal system of government, as we are going to see later on. The principle of Unitarianism shapes the structure of a unitary constitution. So when you believe that the central government is important in a particular state, you are adopting the principle of Unitarianism. And so this principle shapes the structure of the constitution. They adopt a unitary constitution where the powers of the central government is outlined in the constitution to show how the power is distributed within members of the central government. Countries like Britain, France, Italy, and others follow a unitary government system. So now let's move on to the next slide. Alright, let's discuss the features of a unitary state. First of all, the central government holds the primary authority, with local governments having limited autonomy. So we've talked about how power is concentrated in the hands of the central government. So if there are component units within that state, they do not have autonomy. They do not have the independence to make policies and implement policies within the local government. They answer to the central government. They obey all the directives from the central government. Also, laws and policies are uniform throughout the country to reduce regional disparities. And there is a single legislative body that creates laws for the entire nation. So unlike a federal system where they have legislative houses within every state and local governments, in a unitary system of government, there is just one single legislative body that makes laws for the entire nation, and the entire nation has to abide by the laws that have been made by this body. So this system is usually practiced in small homogeneous countries where there is no sharp differences in religion, language, and political beliefs. It's an important system to practice in a small homogeneous country. There is no difference in language, religion, and political beliefs. In a heterogeneous society, a unitary system of government will not work perfectly. So let's look at another feature. In a unitary state, constitutions are flexible and can be amended more easily by the central authority. So unlike a federal state where the constitution is rigid to ensure that the responsibilities of the central government, the state and local governments are perfectly outlined in the constitution, in a unitary state, the constitution is flexible. It doesn't have to be rigid because it doesn't have to outline how power is distributed between the central and the component units. So now let's move on to another feature of a unitary state. Administration and policy implementation are standardized across the country to ensure that growth is uniform. We talked about how the executive in various states have to have set objectives at the beginning of their tenure, and they implement policies in order to make sure these objectives are actualized. In a unitary state, the objectives are the objectives of the central government. They have to ensure that the policies made are implemented all around the state to ensure that growth is uniform around the state. It is different from a federal system of government where different state governments and different local governments have their set objectives and they have to implement policies based on those objectives. So now let's move on to the next slide. All right, we're going to discuss the reasons for the adoption of a unitary state. One of the reasons is homogeneity. So it is best practice in a state where there is no sharp differences in language, religion, political beliefs, etc. So a unitary state is usually a state where they speak the same language, they have the same religion, and they have the same political beliefs. All of this helps to ensure that they have a certain goal that they are all trying to achieve, all the citizens of the country are trying to achieve. But when there is differences in language, religion, and political beliefs, the goals might be different, and you need a federal system of government in that particular situation. So homogeneity has to do with a unitary state. Let's move on to another reason, national unity. A unitary system can foster a stronger sense of national identity and unity as policies and laws are consistent throughout the country. So if you want to ensure national unity within a state, it's important to adopt a unitary system of government. So similar laws, similar policies are enforced all throughout the state, and then there is no difference in the growth of each of the states within the society. So a unitary state is best adopted when you want to achieve national unity. Let's move on to another reason. Efficient administration. The central government can efficiently prevent waste and duplication both in human and material resources. Unlike a federal system of government where you have to duplicate the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary at the different states in the federation, in a unitary state you just need one body, one legislative body. The executive is unified and central, and then the judiciary is the same. So with that, there is no duplication of the various branches of government, and there is no waste of human and material resources. Let's move on to another reason for the adoption of a unitary state. So it is important for crisis management. A unitary system allows for quicker and more coordinated responses to national crises, such as natural disasters or security threats. So unlike a federal system where you have to listen to the voices of each of the states, the component units, this time around you just have a central government who can make decisions for the entire state, and with that they can manage crises as soon as they come. So let's move on to another reason for the adoption of a unitary state. So the absence of tribal grouping. Since there is no marked difference in tribe, unitary system is adopted because no tribe will ever think of dominating others. So when there are a lot of tribes within a particular state, a federal system of government is the system to adopt. But in a country where there are no tribal differences, a unitary system is the best system to adopt. Now let's move on to another reason for the adoption of a unitary state, accountability. In a centralized system, accountability is easier due to power being concentrated in a single authority, unlike in a federal state where responsibility is shared, making it challenging to assign accountability. So in order for accountability to exist within a state, it's important to have a unitary system. So when there is a problem within the state, you know where to lay the blame on, and you know whether or not that particular official needs to retain his position. So accountability is ensured in a unitary state. Let's move on to another reason. Another reason for the adoption of a unitary state is the lack of marked inequality. So in a unitary state, there is a lack of marked economic inequality among different sections of the country. This is because resources are evenly distributed among the various sections to ensure uniform development. So in a unitary state, economic resources are distributed evenly among the various segments of the society. This is unlike a federal state where each region has autonomy, has the ability to designate how the growth of that particular region will go. So with that, there will be uneven development within the states. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, we're going to discuss the merits of a unitary state. One of the merits is rapid decision making. Again, in times of crisis, decision can be made quickly without needing to consult multiple levels of government. You don't need to consult the local, the states before you make a decision. It is also less expensive to run. The cost of running a unitary state is relatively lower than the federal government, as there is no duplication of functions at various levels. Again, you don't need to waste human or material resources in a unitary state. And that merit is stronger national government. The central government can implement nationwide programs and reforms more effectively. So the central government has a set of objectives, and based on that, it can implement nationwide programs in order to reform the society. But this is not the case for a federal system, because each region have autonomy, and they have their own set of objectives, they have their own programs that they need to implement within their states. And so, again, there is no uniformity. And that merit of a unitary state is the promotion of unity. A unitary state prevents the division of the country into various sections. It unifies the state and encourages national consciousness. You have one leader and you look up to that particular leader. With that, there is a sense of national unity, a sense of national consciousness. And that merit is that it reduces red tape. It is less bureaucratic as opposed to a federal system. This is because administrative departments are not duplicated among various levels. You know, sometimes in a federal state, when something doesn't work out at the state level, they may refer you to another office right in the capital. And because of that, there is a lot of red tape, a lot of bureaucracy within the system. This is why a unitary system is better. Now let's move on to the demerits of a unitary state. One of the demerits is the opportunity for dictatorship. A unitary government may encourage dictatorship as a result of power concentration in the hands of a single authority. So when power is concentrated in the hands of the central government, he may feel he has a lot of power and may eventually transition to become an authoritarian leader. So in order to avoid dictatorship, some countries of the world try to avoid the unitary system of government. Also, there is poor representation in government. The system does not encourage wider representation of the people in the government of their country. Again, you have one legislative house, the one at the central level. There are no state legislative houses. And because of that, the interests of several different constituencies may not be adequately represented at the central level. And that demerit is overloading. Since the responsibility of administration is concentrated in a single authority, they might be overloaded with the burden of administrating the affairs of the entire country. With the federal system of government, you have responsibility distributed among the federal, states, and local governments in the country. But in a unitary system, all the responsibility is concentrated in the hands of a single authority. And because of that, they may have a lot of responsibility that they may not be able to complete them. So another demerit of a unitary state is the lack of local autonomy. Autonomy means freedom, independence. So local governments may not have sufficient power to address local issues effectively. So local government should be able to have the independence, the authority to address the issues within their community. But if they don't have the power to do so, they have to refer back to the central government, and the central government may not be able to address the issues as well as the local government will be able to do. So this is a demerit for a unitary state. And that demerit is that it only works well in small and homogeneous states. So it cannot work in federal states with diverse religion, culture, or language. In that particular state, you need a federal system. So now let's move on to the next slide. Now we're going to look at a model example of a unitary state, which is the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom serves as a prominent example of a unitary state characterized by its centralized form of government. The UK Parliament, located in Westminster, is the supreme legal authority capable of creating or ending any law. Laws passed by the UK Parliament apply uniformly across England. So while the UK has local governments, such as councils, their powers and functions are determined and can be redefined by the central government. So we've talked about that. They may have certain power, they may delegate certain powers to different units within the state, but they still hold central authority. These local units that they've designated power to do not have autonomy, they do not have independence. So they operate within the framework set by the central legislation. All courts are subject to the ultimate authority of the United Kingdom Supreme Court in matters of national law. So this is why the United Kingdom is a model example of a unitary state. Now let's move on to the next slide. Now we're moving on to federal government. A federal government is a system of governance in which power is divided between a central or national government and various regional or state or provincial governments. So this time around, power is divided among different units within the states. Let's move on to the next slide. Federalism aims to distribute power and responsibilities to prevent any single entity from becoming too dominant. So unlike a unitary state where power is concentrated in central authority, they have to distribute power in order to make sure that the central government is not too dominant. It doesn't have a lot of power that makes him authoritarian in a sense. So the constitution's supremacy not only commands respect, but also dictates the distribution of power among government levels. So the constitution is supreme in a federal system of government. This ensures that the powers of these different units are outlined within the constitution and are obeyed and respected by each of the various levels within this system. So the central government holds supremacy over matters of common importance to the entire federal state. So that's what the federal government does. It administers over matters of common importance to the entire state. But each state and local government has its own governance structure, yet they are subordinate to the central government. In a federal system like Nigeria, the central, state, and local governments collectively form the three tiers of government. So when they're talking about the tiers of government, we are talking about the federal, the state, and the local levels of government. Now let's move on to the next slide. So how is power divided in a federal state? In federal systems, the division of functions and responsibilities among the different levels of government, the national, the state, and local, is usually organized through legislative lists. So this list specifies which level of government has the authority to legislate and govern in particular areas. And the three primary types of legislative lists are the exclusive list, the concurrent list, and the residual list. So we've talked about how the powers of these different tiers of government are outlined in the Constitution. And this is what is outlined. What powers do each of these tiers have when they are administering the affairs of the state? So let's begin with the exclusive list. The exclusive legislative list contains areas of governance where only the central or national government has the authority to make laws and decisions. So each of these areas are the areas where only the federal government has authority over. So one of them is defense. Then we also have foreign policy, immigration, currency, and national transportation networks. So all of these are the responsibilities of the federal government. So they create roads that connect various states of the country. It is the duty of the federal government to do so. So now let's move on to the concurrent list. This list allows both the central and the regional government to govern shared areas. So it is the list that contains the powers that are shared by both the federal government and the state government. So in case of conflicts, national laws usually prevail. That means the federal government has supreme power over these different areas. That is why they said national laws always prevail. So with constitutions offering dispute resolution methods, so whenever there is a dispute between the federal and the state governments concerning these areas, they usually refer back to the constitution. What does the constitution say about this? So the areas that are under the concurrent list include education, healthcare, environmental protection, labor relations, infrastructural development. So when we're talking about education, for example, the Federal Ministry of Education is the jurisdiction of the federal government, and then we have state commissioners for education who takes care of education at the state level. So that's an example of how this form of power is shared between the federal and the state government. Now let's move on to the residual list. The residual legislative list covers areas that are not explicitly mentioned in either the exclusive or the concurrent list. The authority to legislate in these areas usually falls to the local governments. So examples include primary education, health or maternity centers, library, markets, motor parks, etc. When we're talking about primary education, it's the duty of the local government to create primary schools within the local government. They also create health and maternity centers. When we see health or maternity centers that belong to a particular local government area, then you know it is part of the areas that are designated to the local government. So now let's move on to the next slide. We are going to move on to fiscal federalism. So fiscal federalism refers to the financial relations and arrangements between different levels of government in a federal state. So this time around, it actually has to do with money. How is money shared between the federal, the state, and the local government? That's what we are talking about when we are talking about fiscal federalism. Let's move on to the next slide. All right, it deals with the allocation of taxing and expenditure powers among the national, regional, that's state or provincial, and local governments. So here they are talking about how, when we're talking about taxing, allocation of taxing, tax is the source of revenue for the government. And then we're also talking about expenditure. What do the government have to do? They have to spend some money in order to provide certain services to the people. So that's what we talk about when we're talking about expenditure. It also deals with the mechanism for transferring funds between these levels to ensure efficiency, equity, and fiscal responsibility. So sometimes the federal government has to transfer funds to different states and local governments. So while doing this, he has to ensure that the transfer helps to aid efficiency, and he also has to ensure that there is equity. There has to be some form of balance when he allocates these resources to the different component units. So the goal of fiscal federalism is to optimize the economic performance and service delivery across the various layers of government while maintaining fiscal discipline. The federal government has to be able to allocate these resources effectively, but allocate it in a way that ensures discipline. That means it doesn't have to send so much, it just has to send enough for them to be able to perform their responsibility. So countries like Canada, Brazil, the United States of America, Germany, Switzerland, etc., they all have stable fiscal policies. Nigeria is still developing our own fiscal federalism. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so we're going to discuss the key components of fiscal federalism. There are three key components. We have the division of revenue sources. How do they generate revenue, the money that is needed to perform their responsibilities within the states? So fiscal federalism involves the assignment of taxation powers. Remember I said earlier that they derive their revenue mostly from taxes. They also derive it from other sources, but it's mainly from the taxes that are generated from the citizens of the country. So fiscal federalism involves the assignment of taxation powers to different levels of government as a means for generating income. So the national government controls broader and more mobile tax bases such as income tax and value-added tax. It's the responsibility of the federal government to collect these taxes. But the regional governments, they take charge of property taxes, sales taxes, and other localized revenue sources. Now let's move on to expenditure responsibilities. Again, I talked about how expenditure has to do with using money to provide certain essential services to citizens of the country. So that's what we are talking about when we're talking about expenditure responsibilities. So different levels of government are assigned specific expenditure responsibilities, and this is done so that certain services can be provided. The national government may handle defense, foreign policy, and social security. All of those things that we've talked about under the exclusive list are part of the responsibility of the federal government, and they need money to be able to administer those affairs. The regional government may handle education, healthcare, and transportation. Those things that we talked about under the concurrent list are under the responsibility of the regional government. They also need money in order to perform those duties. Now let's move on to intergovernmental transfer. So to address fiscal imbalances between different regions and ensure equitable services delivery, higher levels of government often provide grants and transfers to lower levels. So we are talking about how the federal government transfers revenue to various state governments in order for them to perform their duties appropriately. So this transfer can either be unconditional, that means you're talking about general revenue sharing, or conditional, which refers to specific purpose grants. When we are talking about unconditional transfers, we are talking about those transfers that are usually given without expecting anything in return from the state governments. But when you are talking about conditional transfer, you are giving out money to these various state governments with the expectation of something in return, maybe an essential service or even revenue. So these are the key components of fiscal federalism. Now let's move on to the next slide. Now we're going to discuss the features of a federal state. One of the features is that powers are constitutionally shared among the central authority and other constituent units, e.g. the states and local governments. Again, the constitution is important. The constitution is supreme in a federal system of government. Regional governments have substantial autonomy. Again, autonomy means independence and freedom. And so they can make laws, they can make policies and decisions independently within their constitutionally assigned areas. So they do not need to wait on the legislature, the executive and judiciary at the federal level in order for them to make and implement policies that will help to drive their particular region forward. Another feature of a federal state is that the constitution is the highest legal authority, and any law or action by either level of government must conform to it. Again, the constitution is supreme, and every single level of government within that state have to conform to the dictates of the constitution. An independent judiciary, often in the form of a Supreme Court, interprets the constitution and resolves disputes between the different levels of government. We talked about the concurrent list, where there are powers shared between the federal and the regional governments. So it is the duty of the judiciary to resolve disputes between the federal and the regional governments whenever there is a dispute as to where their power ends and where their power begins. So now let's move on to another feature. Most federal states have a bicameral means two-chamber legislature, which helps represent both the national and regional interests. Just like here in Nigeria, we have a bicameral legislature. We have the Senate House and the House of Representatives. This is done to ensure that the interests of the various constituencies within the country are adequately represented at the federal level. Okay, so we've come to the end of the first segment of this video. I believe it was enlightening and educative. If you would like to continue with us, please go down to the link in the description below. This takes you to my school website where you can subscribe to our government topic by topic video lesson. When you subscribe, you can continue with us because we are going to move on to the reasons for the adoption of a federal state. We're also going to look at model examples of a federal state, and then we're going to move on to political systems as well. I believe you've enjoyed this content. If yes, please do not forget to hit the like button, click on the subscribe button, and lastly tap on the notification bell to get informed as soon as we release the next videos.